Welcome to 929 Chapters. I'm your host, David Z. Moster, PhD and Rabbi, and today we'll be taking a look at Genesis chapter 7, the story of the flood of Noah, also known as Noah's flood. Today's video will be broken up into 4 parts. I'll begin with a summary and outline of the chapter, then I'll move on to my comment, then we'll read some verses in Hebrew and English, and then I'll leave you with a photo related to the chapter. Let's begin with the summary and outline of Genesis chapter 7. Genesis chapter 7 is in the middle of the first section of the book of Genesis. The first 11 chapters have to do with creation and the first years of mankind, and our chapter is just past the midpoint, and it could also be said that our chapter is the high point or the climax of this section. I broke this chapter up into 3 parts. In the first 4 verses, what I call Yahweh's command, Yahweh tells Noah that he and his family should enter the ark because Noah is righteous and he is going to be saved. Yahweh tells Noah to bring 7 pairs of every species of pure animals onto the ark and 7 pairs of every species of birds onto the ark so that they may be saved. But for the impure animals, Noah is only supposed to bring 1 pair. And Yahweh tells Noah to enter the ark because there are 7 days left until the flood. In the second section, verses 5 to 9, Noah does as he is told. At the beginning, we're told that the flood is to begin in the 600th year of Noah's life. And then we are told that Noah comes with his family and all the animals, 2 by 2, into the ark. And then finally, in the third section, verses 10 to 24, the flood occurs. We are told that the flood starts in the 600th year of Noah's life. And if you're wondering, hey, we were just told that, stay tuned for the comment. The flood begins with 40 days of rain, and on that very day, Noah and all the animals enter the ark. And once again, if you're wondering, wait, didn't Noah already enter the ark? Stay tuned for the comment. Once Noah enters the ark, Yahweh closes the ark for him. And then we're told that the waters grew and grew, and that the mountains were covered. We are told that all living things died, and at the very end of the chapter, we are told that the waters grew for 150 days. That does it for our summary and outline. Let's move on to part 2, the comment. Genesis chapter 7 is one of the most important chapters in the history of biblical studies. And the reason for this is that it led to a breakthrough, a watershed moment in our understanding of not only the flood story, but also the Pentateuch as a whole, and even the entire Bible as a whole. So let's take a look. Genesis chapter 7 and the chapters around it, 6 and 8, have a number of difficulties. There are doublets, meaning the same information is told twice. There are contradictions, meaning the same information is told in different ways. And finally, there are 2 names for Yahweh and the more generic Elohim, God. So let's take a look at each of these 3 individually. In regards to doublets, things being told twice, we have, for example, the year. We're told in both verses 6 and 11 that the flood began in the 600th year of Noah. In verses 6 and 10, we are told that the flood begins. There are 2 beginnings to the flood. In verses 17 and 18, we are told that the ark rises with the water. And then in verses 19 and 20, we are told twice that the mountains were covered by the water. And finally, in verses 21 and 22, and then again in 23, we are told that everyone dies. Let's take a look at one of them inside, verses 19 and 20. In these verses, we are told that the mountains were covered twice. In verse 19, V'mayim gavru ma'od ma'od al ha'aretz, and the water strengthened very, very much on the earth. Vayachusu kol ha'harim ha'gavoim, and all the high mountains were covered. Asher tachat kol ha'shamayim, those that are underneath the skies. And then in the next verse we are told, Chamesh esrei amma milamala gavru hamayim, the water grew 15 amot, arms lengths high. Vayachusu ha'harim, and the mountains were covered. So here we have the case of the mountains being covered twice, one after the other. Now, many biblical texts say the same thing twice, but most of those are poetic biblical texts. What makes Genesis 7 different is that it's prose, it's a narrative, and we have the same information conveyed twice. For example, here, we have the same story of the mountains being covered twice. Now, these are just some of the doublets in chapter 7, and there are many other doublets in chapters 6 and 8 as well. Let's move on to the contradictions. For example, in the previous chapter, chapter 6, verses 19 to 20, we were told that Noah was to bring a pair of every species of animal into the ark. a male and female, just 2 from every single species. But in our chapter 7, verses 2 to 3, we are told that if the animal is pure, Noach was to bring 7 pairs of those animals and 7 pairs of every bird. So whereas in chapter 6 it was 2 for each animal, in chapter 7 it was 2 or 14 for each animal. There's a contradiction concerning when to enter the ark. In verses 1 to 10 of our chapter, Yahweh tells Noach to enter the ark 7 days before the flood, and he does so. However, in verse 13 of our chapter, Noach enters the ark on the day the flood begins itself. And then, when it concerns the length of the flood, the length that the waters were growing, in verses 12 and 17 we are told that the flood is 40 days long, and in verse 24 we are told that the waters grew for 150 days. So, just like with the doublets, let's take a look at one of these contradictions in the text itself. Let's begin with chapter 6, verse 19. Umikol achai, mikol basar, and from all living things, from all flesh, shnayim mikol tavi al teva. You shall bring 2 from each to the ark. La'achayotitach, to make them live with you. Zachar unekeva yihiyu. They shall be male and female. And then in our chapter, verse 2, we see, Mikol behema hatahora, and from all pure animals, tikach lecha, you shall take shiva shiva, 7 by 7, ish v'ishto, a man and his wife, meaning male and female. Umina behema asher lo tahorahi, and from the animals which are not pure, shnayim, 2, ish v'ishto, a man and his wife, meaning a male and a female. So in chapter 6, Noach was to bring 2 of each animal, but in chapter 7, Noach is to either bring 14 or 2 of each animal. And finally, what makes this chapter so interesting is that there are 2 names for Yahweh himself. In a number of cases, Yahweh is simply called Yud He Vav He, Yahweh. However, in other cases, Yahweh is simply called the generic name Elohim, which means God in English. Now, what's so fascinating about this is that a number of the contradictions and doublets that we just mentioned before actually can be divided between one name of Yahweh and the other. Let's take a look at one example from the previous chapter about why Noach was chosen to be saved from the flood. In verse 8 we are told, V'Noach matzachen be'enei Adonai, and Noach found favor in the eyes of Yahweh. In the very next verse we are told, Ela told Noach, these are the generations of Noach. Noach ish tzadik tamim haya b'dor tav. Noach was a righteous and wholesome man in his generation. Eta Elohim hitalech Noach. Noach walked with God. So in the first case, it was Yahweh finding favor, but in the second case, it's Noach walking with God. So these 2 names of Yahweh actually occur in a doublet. One part of the doublet mentions the name Yahweh, and the second part of the doublet mentions the name Elohim, God. Now, over the past hundreds and even thousands of years, a number of biblical exegetes noticed these problems. One example I'd like to point out is Don Isaac Ben Judah Abarbanel, who actually notes most of these doublets and contradictions in his commentary on the Pentateuch. However, until the 1700s, most biblical commentators answered these problems one by one by one by one, meaning that each doublet was meant to convey a certain aspect of knowledge. Perhaps Noach first came to the ark but didn't enter, and then finally Noach entered the ark. Or, for example, in one case, the animals came to Noach, but in another case, Noach took the animals himself. Meaning each case was meant to convey its own message. However, in the 1700s, there's a breakthrough and a watershed moment in biblical studies, and it began with Jean Ostrach, a medical doctor known for treating syphilis, who in 1753 published a book in French called Conjectures on the Original Documents that Moses appears to have used in composing the book of Genesis. Ostrach was born Protestant and he converted to Catholicism, and he was a devout man. By the time of Ostrach, the idea had been floating around by philosophers such as Spinoza and Hobbes that Moses was not the author of the Pentateuch. And what Ostrach tried to do was say, yes, Moses was the author of the Pentateuch. However, Moses was using different sources in composing the Pentateuch, and that's why there's sometimes contradiction. He was using different texts and putting them together. When Ostrach published this book, he was so concerned of it being taken in a radical fashion that he published it anonymously, and you can see here on the title page that he is not mentioned, and also he didn't even publish it in France. He published it in Brussels, which you can see here. What we're looking at here on page 52 and 53 is actually Ostrach's treatment of Genesis chapter 7, and what we can see here is that Ostrach is cutting each and every verse into a different source. For example, at verse 19, which was the first telling of the mountains being covered, Ostrich assigns that to source A. And then in verse 20, which was the second case of the mountains being covered, Ostrich assigns it to a different source, what he calls source C. And then finally, verse 21, he assigns to source B. So what Ostrich was doing was separating the Pentateuch into different sources, different texts that were combined into the text that we have it today. Ostrich's idea grew and grew in biblical studies, and over the next 2.5 centuries, people debated the exact mechanism of what has come to be called the documentary hypothesis. The idea that the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses, were actually composed of a number of different sources. So let's look at how this documentary hypothesis pertains to Genesis chapter 7, our chapter. Most people who analyze Genesis chapter 7 break it up into 2 sources. That is the P source and the J source. P stands for priestly, the priestly source affiliated with the book of Leviticus, and J stands for the Yahwistic source. The J in German is actually the Yud in Hebrew and the Y in English. So J in German is actually a Yah for Yahweh. In the priestly source, Yahweh is simply called Elohim, God. The priestly source is concerned with very detailed numbers, not just simple numbers. So when it says that the flood began in the 600th year, it even gives the detail that it was the 2nd month and the 17th day of that year. In P, the waters burst from above and below. There's not a simple rainfall. There are waters above the world and below the world that were created in the first chapter of Genesis, and these waters burst open and flooded the world. In P, there are only 2 animals from each species. There are no 7 by 7. In P, when we get to it, Noach is going to send out a raven to see if the land is dry. And finally, in P, Yahweh is conceived of as a distant deity, acting from far away, not using his hands, not walking about, being a distant cosmic deity. Now let's look at J. In J, as you might have imagined, the name Yahweh is used. J is more into general numbers. So the flood begins in the 600th year of Noach. Not really too fancy. The waters come for 40 days, nothing too fancy. In J, it's simple rain that falls. There are no waters above and waters below that break. In J, you actually have 7 pairs of pure animals, because in J, there's actually going to be a sacrifice at the end. And if there were only 2 animals of each species, then Noach's sacrifice would have meant the extinction of a few species. In J, Noach uses a dove to find dry land instead of a raven. And in J, Yahweh is an anthropomorphic deity. Well, that's a fancy way of saying that he has human-like concepts. So Yahweh can become sad. Yahweh can think out loud. Yahweh actually closes the ark after Noach enters it. So these are the differences between P and J. All in all, they're minor differences, but when you look closely, you can detect some minor differences between the 2. Next time you open a commentary on the book of Genesis, you'll open it up and you'll see something like this, where the scholar is going to show you what passages he or she considers to be J, and what passages he or she considers to be P. And in this example, we can see here in the white boxes the J source, and in the red boxes we can see the P source. And for most commentaries on the book of Genesis, you'll see a chart that looks something like this. Now I'd like to show you 2 very interesting resources online for studying our chapter in light of this source criticism, meaning studying the text in light of the 2 sources, the J and the P source. The first was made for the Public Broadcasting Service by Richard Elliott Friedman, a scholar in the field, and what we're looking at here at the beginning is the full text of Genesis chapter 7. The blue section is the J source, and the red section is the P source. And what makes this website so interesting is that you can click and just look at the J source alone. There you see it in the blue. Or you can click and look at the P source alone. So if you want to just read J throughout or P throughout, what you can do is click here and you'll see the entire story and you can read it throughout. And it's not only for Genesis chapter 7, it also applies for Genesis chapter 6 and Genesis chapter 8. The second website I'd like to show you is from a website called thetorah.com, and they do a very similar thing. What they first show you is the J text in English, and then they show you the J text in Hebrew, something that the previous website did not have. Then they show you the P text in English, and then the P text in Hebrew. And then finally what they do is they show you the combined text, both in English, and then finally in Hebrew. I'll have a link to both of these websites in the description below, and you can check them out on my website, 929chapters.com as well. That does it for our comment on Genesis chapter 7. What we've seen is that in the flood story, there are a number of doublets, things being told twice. There are also a number of contradictions, things that just don't quite add up. And finally, we have 2 names for Yahweh himself. Now, each of these doublets and contradictions can be explained one by one by one. However, in 1753, there was a watershed moment in biblical studies, and that is when John Ostrich suggested that there are actually a number of different sources underlying the Pentateuchal text, and that eventually led to our understanding of Genesis chapter 7 as being comprised of a J source and a P source. Okay, let's move on to the next section, reading verses inside, and I chose verses 21 to 23, which tell the story of the death of everyone who wasn't in the ark. Parenthetically, after our comment, you might be able to notice some doublets in this section. So let's read them inside. Verse 21. Vayigva kol basar haromes al haaretz. And all flesh that moved around on the earth died. Ba'of uva bahema, uva chaya, uva chol hasheretz, hashoretz al haaretz, v'chol ha'adam. The birds, the domesticated animals, the wild animals, and all creepy things that crawl on the land, and all men. Kol asher nishmat ruach chayim ba'apav. Everything that had the breath of life in its nostrils, mikol asher b'charava, everything that was on the dry land, metu, they died. Vayimach et kol hayakum asher al pnei hadama. And he, meaning Yahweh, destroyed all the establishment which was on the ground. Me'adam ad behema, from man until animal. Ad remes va'ad of hashamayim, until the creepy things and until the birds of the sky. Vayimachu min ha'artz, and they were wiped away from the land. Vayishaer ach Noach va'asher ito bateva. And all that remained was Noach and those who were with him in the ark. That does it for the reading. Let's move on to the final part of our video, the photo. And the public domain and easily shareable photo I picked out for us today is from verse 19. When the waters had swelled much more upon the earth, all the highest mountains everywhere under the sky were covered. And what we're looking at is the water covering the last bit of ground around. Okay, that does it for Genesis chapter 7. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and subscribe. Also, be sure to comment about any of your own ideas on Genesis chapter 7, or if you have any ideas that you would like to see made into a video. Also, I would just like to point out that when we're dealing with the story of Noah and the flood, there are a number of ancient Near Eastern parallels to this, and you should check out my video about how to study the Bible in light of the ancient Near Eastern texts. You can find it here on YouTube. And finally, be sure to check out my website, 929 Chapters, for more information about this chapter, as well to follow me on Twitter and on Instagram. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you next time for Genesis chapter 8.